Welcome to Colossal Works, the biggest things humanity has ever tried to build. On the 10th of August, 1628, the most expensive object in Sweden sailed out of Stockholm harbor. Thousands of people had come to watch. Foreign diplomats, families, sailors' wives. It was the largest, most heavily armed, most beautiful warship the country had ever built. It traveled about 1,100 meters. Then it rolled over and sank, in front of all of them. The ship was called the Vasa, and it was never supposed to be a cautionary tale. It was supposed to be the thing that made Sweden untouchable at sea. This is how a nation built the finest warship of its age, and why it lasted about 20 minutes. To understand the Vasa, you have to understand what Sweden was in the 1620s. It was a rising military power, fighting its way into the 30 Years' War, a conflict that would eventually kill millions across Europe. Its king, Gustavus Adolphus, needed a navy that could dominate the Baltic. The Baltic. And he wanted ships that announced it, so the order went out for something extraordinary. A warship with not one but two full decks of heavy bronze cannon, stacked one above the other. At the time, that was rare, expensive, and genuinely intimidating. Bronze guns cost a fortune. Putting 64 of them on a single hull was a statement about how much Sweden was willing to spend to win. And then there was the decoration. The Vasa was covered in carvings, hundreds of them. Lions, Roman emperors, biblical figures, sea creatures, warriors, all carved in oak and pine, painted in bright colors and covered in gold leaf. This was not decoration for its own sake. In the 1600s, a warship was a floating advertisement for the power of the king who owned it. When the Vasa sailed into a foreign harbor, the message was supposed to arrive before the ship did. Building it took years and consumed enormous resources. Around 1,000 oak trees went into the hull. Hundreds of workers, shipwrights, carvers, painters, ropemakers, blacksmiths were involved. By the time it was finished, the Vasa was roughly 69 meters from the tip of the bowsprit to the stern, with a main mast rising over 50 meters above the waterline. It was, by any measure of the era, a triumph. And it was already in trouble before it ever left the dock. The problem was invisible, and it was simple. The Vasa was too heavy at the top and too light at the bottom. In the 17th century, nobody could calculate this. There was no naval architecture in the modern sense. There were no stability equations, no formulas for center of gravity. Ships were built from experience, from rules of thumb, from what had worked before. And nothing quite like the Vasa had been built before. The shipwrights were in effect guessing, and the ship they were guessing at was heavier and taller than anything in their experience. There is also a detail that has been passed down in the accounts of the disaster, and it is remarkable. Before the maiden voyage, the ship was given a stability test. 30 men ran back and forth across the deck to see how much it would rock. They managed 3 passes before the ship was heeling so badly that the test was stopped for fear of capsizing the vessel at the quayside. The Vasa sailed anyway. So, what actually happened on the 10th of August? The failure came from 3 directions at once. The first was the ballast. To stay upright, a tall ship needs weight low in the hull, stone, usually, to counteract the weight of masts, rigging, and guns above. The Vasa carried ballast. It simply did not carry enough for a hull carrying 2 gun decks and that much timber and gold above the waterline. And here is the cruel part. There was not enough room to add more. The lower gun deck sat too low in the ship. Piling in more stone would have pushed the gun ports closer to the water, which was the exact thing that killed it. The second was the shape of the hull itself. Modern studies of the wreck have found that the ship was not perfectly symmetrical. Evidence suggests different work crews used different measurement systems, one based on Swedish feet, another on Amsterdam feet, which differ in length. A hull built from 2 slightly different rulers is a hull that does not sit evenly in the water. That claim comes from analysis of the recovered timbers, not from a document signed in 1628. So treat it as the best available explanation rather than a confession. The third was the weather, and it was not even dramatic. The Vasa left the harbor under light wind. It was towed along the waterfront, and then a handful of sails were set. A modest gust came down over the hills of Stockholm and pushed the ship over to port. It came back up. Then a second gust arrived, and the ship leaned further and did not come back. Water began pouring in through the open lower gun ports. And they were open because this was a ceremonial departure. The crew had fired a salute. Once the sea found those openings, the outcome was fixed. The Vasa filled, rolled, and went down in about 32 meters of water, roughly 120 meters from shore. Of the estimated 150 people aboard, around 30 drowned. Some had families with them. On a first short passage, it was not unusual to bring relatives along. There was an inquiry. The surviving officers were questioned. The shipbuilders were questioned. And the record of it is almost uncomfortable to read, because everyone involved was standing very close to a truth nobody could say out loud. The ship's design had been approved by the king. The proportions had been signed off. To blame the design was to blame the crown. In the end, according to the surviving accounts, nobody was punished. The verdict was, essentially, that it was God's will. And that should have been the end of it. A humiliating loss, a few salvaged cannons, and a wreck forgotten in the mud of a busy harbor. Which is, more or less, what happened. For 333 years, the Vasa sat on the bottom of Stockholm's harbor while the city grew up around it. But the Baltic Sea is unusual. It is cold, it is low in oxygen, and it is far less salty than the open ocean. The shipworm that devours wooden wrecks in most of the world cannot survive there. So the Vasa did not rot away. It waited. It over them, and my voice. If you went In 1956, a researcher searching old records and probing the seabed found it. In 1961, after years of preparation, cables were run beneath the hull and the Vasa was lifted, essentially whole, back into the daylight. Most of the ship you can see today is the original 17th century timber, not a reconstruction. The actual wood, cut before the invention of the steam engine, the light bulb, or the United States. It now sits in a purpose-built museum in Stockholm, where the air is temperature and humidity controlled to keep it from drying out and collapsing under its own weight. Between its recovery and the start of 2025, more than 45 million people have walked in to look at it. It is one of the most visited museums in Scandinavia, which leaves a strange conclusion. The Vasa failed at literally the only job it was built to do. It never fired a shot in war. It never frightened an enemy fleet. As a warship, it is arguably the worst investment in Swedish naval history. And yet, it is the only ship of its era that anyone outside a university has heard of, seen with their own eyes, or stood underneath. Every ship that worked is gone. This one is here because it failed early enough to be preserved. So what does that make it? A disaster? Or the most successful shipwreck ever built? If this blew your mind, hit that like button and subscribe for more megastructures. And tell me in the comments which one I should cover next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.